in applied economics. And so one of the things I think is really interesting that is a little different for you guys about this kind of stuff and is really key and maybe not as hit on as part of undergraduate research, at least it wasn't in my university, is the amount of research that you have to do and how that can really help you and differentiate you in a business setting. So we'll talk a little bit about like where to find that information, example abstracts, and kind of end with questions after that. So that's generally how we're going to frame this. I don't know how Zoom works exactly. I don't have to raise your hand or unmute yourself, but if you want to ask questions at any point in time, please do that. I'm sure Professor Soner will stop me if you guys have questions. It's meant to be as interactive as possible, so please don't hesitate to stop me at any point. Awesome. So a little bit about me. So I recently took on the role as our GM, and Wayfair has about 1,000 GMs at it. But basically, we love to start new kind of entrepreneurial enterprises even within Wayfair. And so I was asked to come over to our 3D side, and I am a supply chain economics guy from background, so I have no idea about 3D imagery. But we happen to be the largest 3D imager in the home goods space in the world. And so what we do is we take, if you've ever been on Wayfair, we take a whole bunch of different photos of items and then we render them and create them into a 3D lifestyle scene that you may see. And so a lot of our photography, particularly in kind of our, what we call our specialty retail brands, which may be like All Modern, Joss & Main, Paragold, all the way down to some of our brands on Wayfair.com. We typically put the imagery in a 3D setting. And so we create these 3D images, which you can't really tell are created on a computer. It helps us because it's massively scalable. We don't have to build 3D or 2D photography studios all over the world to photograph our items. So that's what I do now. It's a little bit of a departure from what I did previously. And so I'll talk more about that because it has a lot more to do with what you guys are talking about, and specifically the sustainability portion of it. So previously I was the associate director of our inventory side. So I ran, probably about $2 billion worth of product annually through our warehouse system, going out to suppliers and working with them to procure those items. And so why that's particularly important to this group of folks is that you guys are going to look at supply chains across a lot of your companies, and you're going to find probably that is the most impactful thing to sustainability that you're going to come across. So whether it is raw material sourcing for a food company, I just heard someone talk about Best Buy, how the electronics for Best Buy are sourced, not from the retail brand itself, but all the way back to who's manufacturing those, where are they being manufactured, what are the componentry that goes into them, how is it transported around the world and finally sold to somebody. Supply chain is probably the biggest component from a sustainability process of our whole kind of economic system. Obviously, there's raw materials mining and that whole process which has to take place, whether it's farming to actual mining of iron ore. So there's a lot of different components, but the supply chain is the one that connects them all. Thus, you're going to have a lot of conversations around it. And so my role previously was, how do I make the supply chain for Wayfair simpler? How do I work to get product from Asia, where if you guys are familiar with furniture and home goods, almost everything is sourced out of China, Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, Indonesia, India, and Turkey. And so you have a massive, and the US is actually a large manufacturer of upholstered goods. So you have a wide dispersed range geographically of manufacturing, very different labor groups, very different environmental implications across different geographies. And so you get a really complex picture of how things go. And so my job was to bring all that stuff and utilize like the thought processes of our supplier base to go try to get the best product at the cheapest rate and try to bring it in a very cost efficient way. And so while not everything I did was altruistic and good for the environment, completely acknowledge that, a lot of what our job is in supply chain is to try to cut down on waste. And so one of the things I was particularly involved in was building on a software that is proprietary to Wayfair called Wayfair. And so we've talked about it on our calls. Our CEO and board of directors are very involved in the understanding and how this software was developed. But ostensibly, it was a software developed to get product to closest to our end consumer as possible by predicting what was going to be purchased by our end consumer, and then giving the right signals across the supply chain to get it there in just in time. And so are you guys familiar with the just in time strategy from supply chain? Most of you? Any supply chain people?
I was muted. Feel free to raise your electronic hand too, or you can also type out a response in the chat.
Some supply chain people, maybe.
I'm gonna call out Alex. Alex is supply chain.
So Alex, do you have a background, or have you learned about just in time yet?
I think so. I know it's essentially like getting things to production when they're going to be used, rather than getting them sitting in places for too long.
Yeah, that's essentially it. And it's not just production, it's the retail, it's every part of the supply chain is where just in time comes in. And so you think about it. And so like, I have to admit, I'm a massive procrastinator. And so I love to not have to do my homework back when I was in college. I love to not have to do my work at work until I have to. But one of the things that is like the greatest benefit, and Professor Stoner's gonna hate me for saying this, but like one of the greatest benefits you get from procrastinating that works in supply chain is you have the most information you can when you have to make the decision. And so just in time is similar in that aspect, in that you're able to take product and get it to a point where you have to make a decision, but you have the most information on demand. And so demand is a massive component of understanding what you need to do, right? So knowing what the market is going to do. And so you have lead times of these items that take really long. And so if you can shorten lead times, if you can get product to a location faster, you don't have to make decisions and guesses later and later back in the supply chain. And so the more you can implement a just-in-time system, the smarter decisions you make across the way. And these little incremental benefits you get add up to massive gains on the other end from a cost perspective. Lack of, you don't have to get rid of inventory, right? Like if you had to take a guess today what the mask usage would be in the summer of 2021, like because of COVID, that's a big guess, right? But if you can guess in, April of this next year, what mask demand is going to be like because of COVID in next summer, like you have a lot more information, you're able to make greater decisions, and you probably aren't going to make a lot of waste. And thus you can bring costs down for consumers. And so there's a lot of benefits, one of which is the environment, right? And so when you're talking about demand, a lot of times you guys probably hear about food waste being a massive one. There is waste in our world too, right? Like there's furniture that does not get used. There are things that don't get consumed by people. And so when you talk about waste, it is pervasive across the supply chain. And so when you're someone like me in my former position, my job is to remove as much waste as possible, which literally translates into waste in product waste and transportation waste. Yep.
Chris, I have a question.
Sure.
What does Wayfair do with all of the product that doesn't get sold, that just sits in the warehouses?
So we will typically donate a lot of that. So that is what happens there, or we'll scrap some of it. So it doesn't go to a person necessarily all the time. We'll try to get rid of it. But if the cost to transport it to a donation center is more than just throwing it in the garbage, that's what happens. And so like, how do you determine what's more? Like those of you who are doing taxes and accounting, like that's how you do it, right? Like if you can write off inventory, didn't depreciate those assets, and that becomes a zero on your balance sheet, to pay $1,000 to truck it to like the United Way. If you're not a good company and you like just don't want to eat that a little bit, you just throw it in the garbage. So there's a lot of things across the disciplines you guys learn at Bentley, from kind of like your would it be like accounting 101 that apply to the way people treat inventory and how that gets either thrown away or used for good purposes. So
Chris, Jimmy has a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to interject. I used to work at Staples, unrelated from Wayfair, but since you were talking about like donating your items, I just wanted to let you guys know that Staples made us throw out whatever returns we had or whatever, and we couldn't donate it or anything. So just another reason to hate Staples. Yep.
That's insane. Why, and just similar to what Chris was talking about, it was going to cost them more to donate it than it was to just chuck?
Probably, yeah. It was probably just easier to just chuck it, so they had us do that. It was, I don't know, or they just hate like people, the less fortunate. That's what I like to say because I hate Staples. So, yep.
That's insane.
Returns are a tricky one. Like there's some legal implications around it. Like we take mattresses are a great example. Like we get returned mattresses. So if you don't like your mattress, you can return it to us, get your money back, right? Great, for sales. But what do we do with those mattresses? We're legally not able to do really anything with them. And so that is, it's not only cross-disciplinary with a business, it's like political, like, right, how does that happen? You're creating waste because there's a policy that's meant to protect consumers, but really then you have these unused mattresses that just go in the garbage. So one thing I do want to touch on quick, and then I'll get through kind of my presentation a little bit faster, is the waste that I worked on in the project that I worked on was really getting product to that consumer at the last possible moment so you could sell it to them right away in the just-in-time fashion. And so what that does is the transportation supply chain, as you guys are learning about carbon emissions and so on and so forth, being able to get product to a consumer, and so the traditional way of retail from back in the day, before, especially before e-commerce, was called the hub and spoke model. And so what you do is you'd get product from the cheapest location, whether that was Asia or even the US, and you'd ship it to like a massive warehouse in LA, or maybe even in central United States outside of Chicago or in Kentucky or someplace like that, where you have some density. But generally it was like cheaper just to get it into like Riverside County outside of LA, because you brought a boat from Asia. It was easier to get it over to California than it was to go all the way around to like New York or the St. Lawrence Seaway. And so you get it, you throw it in a big warehouse in California, and then someone would take it and they'd ship it to like all these other warehouses, and then they'd finally ship it to a store. And so that was kind of like the hub and spoke. So you had multiple hubs, similar to what you guys are familiar with, like on an airline, right? You don't fly directly out of Boston everywhere. Typically, like even here, you got to fly to New York for a lot of places, or you're going to fly to Chicago. So you guys are familiar with that model. The problem is the most efficient way to fly anywhere is directly, right? And so the most efficient way to get you product is the same thing, is to do it directly, not through this. So you don't have to incur all the transportation costs, burn all that fuel, run all those, build even more transportation devices. So like a truck or, a different container ship, or even the offload to dredge another port, right? And so that's another thing we've been doing a lot of, is dredging ports. But because the more efficient you can make that, and the more just in time you can make those nodes, the less you have to do of all those things in between. And so the algorithm that I worked on with our team at Wayfair was to build out a proprietary tool to let us do that as quickly as possible with the least amount of information at the right time. And then also tell us what nodes did we have the ability to go back and influence. So like if we could have shortened the lead time for our suppliers to manufacture by 10 days, we were able to save maybe $10 million. It would help tell us that was how we needed to do it. So there's a lot of things in this world, and I'll kind of stop after this, but in supply chain and in your world, when you guys go into business, that have a lot to do with sustainability, it may not come out like that initially, but if your job is really to reduce waste, which is most people's job in the world, is to make things more efficient. Supply chain just happens to be like a full out career path that is basically just on that. You're basically doing sustainability during your career. Cool. Any questions or anything before I jump into kind of the next part? No, we're good. Okay, cool. So you guys are doing your kind of sustainability cases on a bunch of different companies. You're going to be doing your document, and you're also going to be doing the slides and presentation. So one of the things I think is most important is knowing your audience, right? So some of the folks you probably talked to are other people within Wayfair. And so one of the things, like I explained what I did on my job, and there was a side project I ran, basically looking for us to sustainably source wood for all our furniture, which is hard because we don't actually buy any of the furniture we make at Wayfair. So we have suppliers who make it, and they own it throughout the whole chain of transportation to your door. actually right before we get it to your door. So as soon as it leaves our distribution center, that's when we own it. We purchase it from them. It's a nice cash flow situation for us because you pay us and then we pay the supplier like 90 days later. So if any of you guys are in accounting, that's a pretty neat little trick that we do. But we don't own the inventory, so we don't actually source it. But I've been involved heavily with trying to get our suppliers to go and as a consortium, go buy sustainable wood together to bring down the pricing. And so these are some mechanisms I learned because I used to run or help run our consortium for Burger King's purchasing group. So not sustainable in any way, shape, or form, but I have a lot of background in commodities purchasing from my time at Burger King corporate. And so we tried to do that at Wayfair. It's run into a lot of hurdles. It's a really tough thing, but luckily it's still going on as kind of a side project. But some of the people that will probably talk to you are involved in that project with me. We have a couple really great directors who are involved and come from MIT's sustainability focus for their MBAs. And so I think we'll be able to get the director of sustainability and our legal counsel. So he does a lot of lobbying for us at Wayfair, even if it's not on sustainability, for our workers, for a number of causes that we think are important. So he'll probably come, and then probably another person involved in supply chain and who has a sustainability background. So the thing with these people are they're highly knowledgeable in their fields. The likelihood is that they have a massive amount of knowledge outside of just the thing that is on their resume. Most of us are not like just out of school, so we've had a couple years to get some grades and also like learn a couple things. So even if they say on their resume for Wayfair that they're like the head of mattresses or something like that, the likelihood is they may have been a corporate consultant who knows banking regulation. So think of these people as most likely highly knowledgeable about a lot of things. So you're not going to really like slide things underneath them that they won't get. So you may get a random question out of nowhere because they have some 10 years of experience in another location. So think of them as like subject matter experts across everything. You guys are savvy with technology, so use LinkedIn to stalk them. That's such an easy way to win. You'd be surprised at how many people don't do that in their interview process. Like when I interviewed for Wayfair, I had a note card of every single person I was interviewing with, the school they went to, the backgrounds they had. Like, it is just a simple skill you guys should be using and taking advantage of from here on out. Yes, you can draw some inferences by like what school they went to, kind of where they're from, the different industries they've been in. And so it's a great way to draw out some similarities between you and some connections. I think you guys are smart. You guys use social media, use LinkedIn, use it here. And then lastly, I think the other couple really important things are they're going to want to pre-read. So make sure you have your content buttoned up on your slide deck ahead of time as much as possible. And one of the weird things, and so it's changed a lot since I was in college, where a slide deck was meant to be a starting position for you to talk 2 points. And so what these folks are used to is a little bit more content heavy slide decks. So like if you go into Amazon, what they do is they actually write a whole page in prose or maybe multiple pages before a meeting. You sit down and you take 10 minutes to read like 2 pages of prose, as opposed to like having someone talk to everything. And so a lot of my meetings that I'm accustomed going into at Wayfair are less on the presentation and a lot more asking questions. So these folks will be kind of bent towards that. It doesn't mean that you won't get to present and do that, because I think public speaking is obviously an important part of what you guys need to learn. But be ready for like a lot of really good questions early before you ever get through a lot of your content, because they have pre-read and they have thought through a couple of things they want to ask. And so the last thing I'll touch on, and I know I'm running close on time, is the high bar for creative thought. And so one of the things that you'll find as you go through this stuff, and I'll hit on this, like kind of goes into the next set of things, is the bar for your creativity and thought is more important than getting it right. If I could tell you anything that you take away from this, other than like the environment's very important and like you should be able to feel empowered to like do things about it in your business world, is that when you go into business, having the ability to make decisions with 60% of the information, 40% of the information is probably the greatest differentiator you'll ever have. And not being correct every time is okay. And so one of the things they'll want to see is that you had creative thought, you thought through a problem more than just like at the surface level. You maybe came to a decision or a conclusion of how to tackle a problem that you guys find in your research, and that you researched it a little further than just like reading their stupid environmental statement, which is a bunch of BS anyway. That you went a step further and you thought through it. Like that is the most important thing in business. And if you want to get promoted out of your first position, like you'll go into a company, they'll tell you to do 50 things, and it'll be the one time they don't tell you to do something that you actually do something and you make a decision that will get you promoted the first time. So like if I can impress upon anything, like having and displaying critical thought, and the ability to think creatively in the light of not having all the information is one of the largest differentiators of you in the job market. And I would highly try to do that during this presentation, because like you're not going to get penalized for it. And I'm sure Professor Stoner is going to say like, hey, if you get it wrong with a bunch of experts there, they're going to be more excited for you that you tried and you thought a little bit about it than tried nothing.
So, and Chris, that's a great point, and I just want to emphasize that there will be a lot of assumptions made in these presentations. So for instance, one of the things that I mentioned that I ask you guys to do is evaluate sort of the cost benefit of the environmental strategies that your company implements. And a lot of those numbers aren't out there. A lot of these companies aren't required, actually, pretty much all of these companies aren't necessarily required to release financials on their environmental initiatives. So they'll talk a big game in their environmental sustainability reports, like we've reduced, CO2 emissions by 20%. Okay, cool. What does that actually mean in terms of overall costs, right? And one of the things that I want you guys to do is try and dig into the literature, do the research on what that might look like financially, because we want to see if these environmental initiatives that the companies are implementing are actually, financially beneficial. And so that's a tough job to do, because again, these companies are probably not going to release much of that information. So you're going to be making a lot of assumptions. It's totally fine to make a lot of assumptions as long as you justify your assumptions. And what we're going to be looking for, the guest judges, myself, we're going to be looking for that critical thought that Chris just mentioned, that you actually dug into the financials, that you actually did research and really thought critically as a group about what the company is doing as far as their environmental strategies go. Sorry, Chris, to interrupt.
No, it's okay. A good example of that, and I'll kind of pause for any questions, but a great example is like when you get numbers that sound compelling from different companies that you're reading through in their environmental reports, like, oh, we reduced 50 tons of blah, blah, blah. But if they produced like 200 million tons of something, like 50 tons is nothing. So make sure you put everything in context. Like you have to be a little bit of a mathematical sleuth, and it's not like it's hard math, like I have a master's degree in applied economics, and this is just basic math, guys. Like it's more fun. I enjoy it when I can put things in context and call bullshit on people, especially a bunch of corporate hacks who are like trying to throw together something that's terrible. And you can call like, hey, that was the worst. Like that's a ploy right there, and I'm going to call it out. And use some math to do it. Like that's cool. And it's not very complex. And so you just have to dig a little deeper, right? So put everything in context. When they say it's going to be, 1 million pounds of this, or like 500,000 straws of that, or like we've reduced X percentage of this, it doesn't mean anything unless you know the denominator. So try to dig into that a little bit more. Any questions before I kind of dig into like how you should probably do that and some of the better avenues to look into?
Are there any questions for Chris so far? And Chris also, I see on the bottom, has his email here. So one of the things that he's graciously done in the past is had his email available for you guys to contact him, ask him any questions. It's also just worth networking, and having that ability to chat with him offline is helpful. So if that's okay, Chris, if these guys have questions for you, they can contact you too.
Yeah, we've had a number of folks that, and I used to be in charge of our undergraduate recruiting, like on the business side. Like we get like, obviously we have a team of undergraduate recruiters, and then we have kind of business sponsors. So I used to sponsor about a third of the business from our operations pipeline. So I've got a couple connections in the recruiting side, and we've been lucky to get a couple people from this class into Wayfair. So, if you're interested in Wayfair and we have some roles that interest you, please feel free to kind of bug me. It's nice when you do well in front of me and then a couple other really great judges, and we can see that you got, that interest, you're able to kind of communicate. That's a very important thing at Wayfair is communication. And then you show that creative and like desire to kind of go further. So good opportunity.
And Chris, just to add to that, I will say, like, you've told me in the past that students that from this class that have done really well and they apply to Wayfair, if they've done well, you can sort of move their applications up, right?
Well,
I'm allowed to say that.
Yeah, I know, like, one of the things you guys learn is connections are very helpful. It doesn't mean you don't have, like, the bar gets dropped. Like, that's definitely something that doesn't change at Wayfair. But it's nice to have your resume at the top of the group that gets in for an interview process. It's usually nice to have people in. It's been weird now that we're doing this all remote, but there's definitely an opportunity to like make connections in any, any company. It's going to be the same. And so like getting your resume at the top is usually a nice little boost to the whole process. Okay. Any questions quick before I jump onto like how I would go about doing some of this? Nope. Quiet group. Do you guys love learning on Zoom? I can't imagine this has got to be like the worst thing.
It's not the greatest.
Go to college, not the
It's not
Zoom.
the greatest. We're trying, right, team? It's a great class. These guys are awesome. They're a really seriously amazing class. So I'm very lucky, but it's not ideal.
All right. So next steps, the way I would go about it, like you have a ton of research opportunities. You got a library. I'm sure you got librarians you can talk to. But like dig deep, don't try to fill in your slide deck and your content for your paper before you do like, read 5 or 10 papers. And so like, you don't have to read everything. There's a lot, most scientific papers or peer reviewed papers have most of their information up front in the kind of the abstract. So go read those things, spend a little more time reading than you thought you would. You're going to find interesting stuff anyway. So like, it may feel like you're about to drag out 2 hours of reading for this, but really it'll go fast once you find some pretty cool, interesting things. And as you read through, the best way to find the next set of information you need to go after is the citations in the paper you read about from another paper. And so it's a super easy way to basically cut down the time you have to go searching, is just read the papers that the paper was citing before it. So that's just an easy trick on how to go get a bunch of information. And one of the things, like I said, and Dr. Soder said, is you're not going to get everything from that company, and you're not going to get everything from a paper on that company. And some of the things you're going to find are industry papers for that industry. And so an easy way to think about it is if your company says they are 80% of the food agro industry for corn, right? Like then go look at an agro corn, paper, and then assume that whatever it says is about 80% is relevant to your company, right? And so that can happen with retailers if they say they're X percentage of this. So don't think that because you don't have a specific paper on your company that you can't get a lot of information about your company from a more like a macro paper on the industry. So, and those are really interesting too. Like I like reading that stuff. Maybe I'm just weird, but like I read as part of my sustainability stuff for wood sourcing, which I know nothing about, other than like I like to go to Home Depot and like hack it up on the weekends, is that like there are a whole bunch of interesting things going on in the industry. And so reading those papers, I could learn about like the dynamics of wood production, and I learned a heck of a lot more. And so as you dive in, some of those industry focused papers that aren't on your company are actually the most interesting to read. and give you the most information without having like explicit call outs for your company. Last thing I said, like divide and conquer, like you've got a lot of people on your teams, I think. So like make sure you guys start to take on topics differently. If you can divide your literature up and read it, I think that's always important. So you can kind of become a subject matter expert in your kind of niche. But otherwise, like spend more time on the research than you think. And if you spend more time on the research than you think, everything else just comes together faster. And so if you focus too heavily on the deliverable, you are going to realize it's thin, you can put a lot of holes in it, but if you spend a lot of time on the research, it may feel like you're missing out on getting the thing done, but really you're just going to make it so much faster to write that paper and so much faster to put your slides together.
Chris, just jumping in, there's no paper this semester, so it's just a slide.
Oh, no paper?
No paper.
You guys have it easy. So do all the research, and then you're gonna have to choose between all the cool stuff to get it into your slides. Chock full of great stuff. Definitely do an outline though. Do an outline for your slides. And then if any of you guys want to get into management consulting later on, like a Bain or a McKinsey or something like that, you better be good at outlines. So if you Google the dot dash system from McKinsey, they love that stuff. I'm not a consultant, but if you guys want to make some money and work 90 hours a week, then that's the life for you. All right, any questions on that stuff? I think the last thing I have is just an example of an abstract.
Chris, can I ask a question?
Yep.
So can you give, since you've been doing this now for a couple of years with me, can you give these guys some examples of some of the presentations that have stood out to you, like what differentiated them from other presentations, if you can recall?
Yeah, my favorite ones are like when you take a bunch of people like me and you'll probably get Pat O'Brien and Derek Oliver and a couple other of my colleagues in there. And like those two have MIT degrees. I've got a master's degree in economics. And like we start listening to your presentations and all of a sudden it's going from like, we think it's going to go one way and we're very sure like you're going to take it this one direction and you take it a completely different direction in something we've never thought of. And that is really intriguing and it's provoking and you use data to back up your assertions and thought through it. So like a great, thing would be like, I think we've talked about, Starbucks with someone and like immediately when you hear Starbucks, and so I'm sorry if I'm stealing anyone's thunder on Starbucks, is like, okay, we're gonna talk about straws. And like, everyone knows that straws are like this tiny little piece of plastic for that giant plastic thing. And then like the boxes of plastic in the back that hold all the plastic, like, it's nothing. Come on, like we know that's nothing. Like we're not stupid. Like when you see it in comparison, the plastic that we're dealing with in straws for Starbucks is nothing. And so like we've seen, groups go through the straw thing for like 3 parts of their presentation. You're like, guys. And then one group did it and they go in Starbucks and I'm like, oh, here come the straws. And they go, biodiversity in the way it's being produced, the cocoa in South America. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. Okay, like we hadn't thought about that. And they did a massive amount of research on the production of coffee, and then we're able to equate it back to Starbucks and their impact overall and how that impacted biodiversity and a whole bunch of different things. And it was like, okay, we expected one thing, we got taken in another direction that was really interesting. You backed it up with a lot of data. It's not like this plastic stuff isn't important, but like we predicted you would go down the plastic road and you took a really interesting topic, like, turn over here. And so I think that was like a great example where a group did a ton of research on it. You could tell they learned, like they got their own little like graduate degree in like soil ecology and like farming. And like, I wouldn't have surprised me if one of those people eventually goes and starts their own kind of coffee manufacturing company after. So like it was, they loved it and they learned a whole new discipline that like no one else in the class I think got. And so I think that was probably the best example of something where we were, as a group of folks, like expecting one thing, we got taken in a different direction. It was new, interesting, and we learned a lot. And that was probably the best presentation, I think, of one of the best that I've seen.
Yeah, and just to build off of that, one of the major components of this project is also the sort of the creative recommendations that you guys have as a group for the company to improve their environmental sustainability initiatives at the company. So the other thing I would say is the more creative you can be, the more innovative you can get with those recommendations, the better. As long as you can sort of financially back them up. I think that from what I've also seen, the guest judges get really excited when people have very creative suggestions for their companies. Like, do you remember, Chris, the Disney group that had the really interesting, so there was a group that presented on Disney that, you know, without getting too far into it, but basically one of the big issues was with the parks and taking over a lot of wetland in Florida to develop more park. And so one of their recommendations, and they did the financials for it, was taking old Olympic facilities and converting them into Disney parks. And they had like a pretty nice, tight argument as to why that made financial sense to do. So those types of recommendations and that creative thinking is really interesting, I think, to the guest judges.
Yeah, and honestly, their presentation was like ho-hum until that point, and then they came to the creative side, and we're like, oh, you actually thought through this. Like, they were able to equate, I think, like land usage, like literally square footage and acreage in Florida to what they could do for similar sites, and so like they thought through it, and that's the kind of stuff that like Wayfair does on a daily basis. You know, I'm running a new segment of the business that never existed, and our market is unproven, and like every day I get people who ask me like, okay, what should we price this at? And like, we've never done this, and as an industry, what I'm leading is brand new, but I have to come up with some perspective. And I'm like, I know I don't know the answer because we've never done it. We've never sold this imagery stuff that I do now. But I have to find some way to justify it and think about it in context and convince my, you know, colleagues that that's a decent idea, hear what they have to say. And so that's what like is a real entrepreneurial bone that like you can flex in this assignment is doing that part. So any questions before I jump into the abstract example here? Bueller.
Zoom teaching, my friend, Zoom teaching.
No questions? You
Any
can ask like, how like your job at Wayfair? Like you could ask anything.
Any questions for Chris?
I got a question. Well, it's not about this, but like, so what's like your day-to-day at Wayfair? Like what do you do compared to like Zooming now versus when you were actually in the office and like the company culture and all that? How has it changed in your mind?
So like the joke around Wayfair is that like we love coffee chats. So it is a highly social, highly network focused like area. And so like one of the things you do, especially when you get into like, you know, I guess middle management, like I'm at, or pseudo senior manager, whatever, I'm like some weird amalgam in between, like you spend probably 30, maybe even 40 to 50% of your time just talking to people who are around your level or above or even below, like getting to know them, getting to understand like their abilities, getting to like talking about the culture, talking about the vision of the company, of the vision of your area. And so like, we all worked in Copley, and there's about 10,000 of us in Boston. And the amount of money that we must have spent at Starbucks or near a cafe or like any Blue Bottle is probably in the tens of millions of dollars, maybe even hundreds of millions of dollars, because we go get coffee like all the time. So that is a very big shift between what we did as a company culture to now, where we're on, you know, Google Meets for us all the time. And I think one of the things that has changed is like, we were hyper fast before, and now we're a little bit slower, I think, in general, maybe a little more methodical. And so people have time to like step back, like think in their home about what they're doing, and like try to really reduce like moving for the sake of moving. So I think that's been positive in some ways, that like we really approach problem solving a little bit different than like, you know, before our motto was like, move fast and make mistakes, and then, you know, quickly learn from them. And now it's more like move at the pace of like Zoom and, you know, and try to be a little bit more methodical. And yeah, we'll still make mistakes, but like, and try things that are new, but probably not as much mistake making, but a little bit slower pace.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
I also, Chris, don't you guys have like alcohol on every floor at Wayfair, so you guys would have like pub time all the
Yeah,
time?
my alcohol consumption has gone down from being home. We have kegs on. So we have like 7 stories above the Copley Mall, if you guys are familiar with that place, and basically all of that office tower. And we have more office space. I think probably like 1.5 times more office space than the full Prudential Tower. So if you couldn't even fit Wayfair into the Prudential Tower. And we have another building too on another place. So we're probably like 2 times the size of the Prudential Tower as far as office space. There's a lot of us in Boston. And every other floor had either kegs or wine or both. So very much a social corporate culture. But you could wear like this. So like it's not a, business casual. It's definitely just casual kind of world.
Any other questions for Chris? Oh, Vanessa.
Kind of just like a general question. What is could you elaborate maybe on like the general attitude towards like sustainability and moving towards those initiatives at Wayfair?
That's a great question. I think you guys have probably seen like maybe a couple of years ago, we got into such a kerfuffle for, pretend like I'm from like 1920s using that word, but like around mattresses and being sent to the southern border. Does anyone remember that news story that we got like killed for? Okay, a couple of you. So basically, and sadly, I have to say I was involved, not necessarily to my knowledge. I used to be in charge of mattresses, and so we got an order from a church that needed tons of mattresses, and it happened to be right around the time a bunch of tornadoes hit Texas. And so we got the order, and I assumed like, oh, it's a church, tornadoes just happened. Oh, it's got to be going for them. And we fulfilled an order for thousands and thousands and thousands of mattresses, like out of our own warehouses. We got our suppliers to do it, and we did it really quickly. I go on vacation to the Bahamas, and I get an email alert that like, hey, Chris, did you know that like that order is actually going to a contractor who's the church for the Department of Homeland Security to be used at the detention centers at the southern border for children? And I was like, oh no. And so we had already shipped the order, it was gone. And it turns out that our B2B team knew that this was kind of the thing, but being in supply chain, they just told me it was the church. And I said, I probably should have asked more, and which is like a great learning for me, and something we did later on, which was like, we put our own procedures on our supply chain team to like double check who are we sending this crap to. And so, like a whole bunch of stuff ensued. I had to like call my boss from vacation on Bahamas, tell him what was going on. He had to like go figure out, and like, he's a VP, and like, it was a whole mess. And then obviously got on the news, it got a lot of press. And I was even in like the Bahamas airport, which is about the size of a thumbtack, getting questions from people about it because, string up a conversation. They're like, where are you from? Oh, where you work, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, oh, did you send it? And I'm like, oh shit, I did. So it became a big thing around the corporate culture. We had a walkout. We had a whole bunch of advocacy. We had a group formed internally to guide us on who we'd sell to, which we were very much like, capitalism, yay, let's sell to everybody. But it became an important thing for the culture of the company. And you can imagine like the leanings of Boston, the type of people we hire, we're a fairly liberal group. Even though our customer base is a little bit more Midwest, Central America, it is a different, we kind of have some philosophical stuff. So the corporate culture changed quite a bit after that, and environmental stuff has been a massive part of the advocacy process. And so the reason I tell this story about like the other stuff, which is not environmental related, is because the amount of ability for change really comes from the company itself now, and not the corporate head, the employee base. And the employee base has gotten massively active at Wayfair for a variety of different things, including environmental change. And so you've seen like every company town hall we have with employees, whether it's a full one or a managerial level, which I go to, there is a question undoubtedly every single time on what are we doing to promote sustainability? And so it has become a bigger and bigger focus. I have personally been pushing for some things internally, like that wood sourcing one, and it's gotten a lot of traction. In fact, like, as an associate director, you don't get a lot of time to be like, I'm going to do a side project for fun. And I basically forced my VP into doing it because there was a lot of push around it. And so now we have a playbook internally before COVID hit of how to go and source wood sustainably that ideally we can implement in the next couple of years. And so a lot of activism around like sustainability within these companies is not coming from the top anymore. It's coming from activism within the employee base. And so you have all these people who are like-minded, who want to sell sustainable products. They want to feel good about the fact that they're selling, $10 billion worth of product, and that hopefully not, it's not ending up in landfills. And so like, we're being way more active with how we pursue this as a group going forward.
Thank you.
Answer your question, Vanessa?
Yes.
Awesome.
Any other questions for Chris? Okay.
So I'll run through this last one quick, and then I have a 12:30 I've got to jump off for. But the last thing I want to leave you with is an example. And so when I first talked to this class, probably, I don't know, years ago, 2-3 years ago, I decided I needed an example of like, how to do research quick. And I was sitting in Dr. Stoner's office, like putting this slide together last minute. I told you I like to be a procrastinator. And I was like, I need an example last minute of how to find like good research, and literally typed into a search engine. I think it was Google, and like look at Google Scholar. And this came up as an example for Disney. And this thing is just the abstract. So just like the thing that pops on your screen from a search, like you don't even have to double click into the PDF. Like this is just it. And it basically tells you almost everything you need to know to get started on, for Disney, this was for Disney, on energy usage within their parks and in their facilities. And so like, it's amazing how a little research you need to do to get like that big start you need. Like I know when I'm doing a project or I'm doing something, I need like that first big push to get me going. And it's not that much work to get a lot of great information, even from an abstract, from a Google search on the company that you're talking about, right? This is probably a great cherry-picked example, but it's important to note that like, you may not have to go that far. So at least start the research, see if you get an example like this, where you have a chock full of information about like what they're doing to their facilities. And then you can take that and then use that search criteria for, to find out the rest of the information and find papers on that paper. So just wanted to say it's a lot easier than you think to get started on this stuff. If you haven't that is one thing you don't want to procrastinate on, is the research, because you don't want to run out of space to do it. But you may want to procrastinate on when you get start putting it into your slides, because the more information you can have from the research standpoint, the better. That's it for me.
Thanks, Chris. Are there any other questions for Chris before we wrap up? All right, thanks again. And again, team, if you need to send Chris or want to send Chris an email, even just introducing yourselves, that's great, and I'm sure would be well received. So thank you to Chris. Yay. Thanks so much.
Thanks, guys. Now I got to figure out how to get out of this thing.
Say leave meeting.
I don't even know where that is. Oh.
At the bottom, the red button. It should say leave meeting.
Stop share. All right, I found the red button. All right, thanks, guys. Have a good one.
Bye. Thanks. Okay. Yay! Thanks, everybody. That was awesome. I'm going to stop recording.